Let me just say, this is an unusual guest, and I'm beaming because he's one of the more fascinating people I've ever met. And I've interviewed just about everybody, so you've interviewed a lot of people, met a lot of people. The one intro I had, which I'm not going to use, is our next guest is an intelligence expert who counsels the White House, the Pentagon, to keep us safe, and also played the solo. And Rikki, don't lose that number, which is an odd which is the really no really.
Really? No, really. Really? No, really. Really?
He's one of the most creative guitarists. He's a producer, a writer. He was a first call studio musician, which means we need a guitarist in here. Here's the guy that you call. He's become a consultant for national security, counterterrorism expert, and he understands outside of the box thinking, and that's what I wanted to talk about today, the comparison between music and counterterrorism, and that it's really interesting because he has some quotes like, teaching analysts how to improv is like analysis is part science and part art. And you go, I never thought of it that way. So that the people who do an analysis, if they could open up their heads and be more artistic and more creative, may be able to think outside of the box. So with that, without further ado, it's a pleasure having you in. And the album, I should say, is called The Speed of Heat. It took you 16 years to do your solo album, but every cut is different. And every cut, Jason and I were talking about guitar. We just saw The Grateful Dead, and we saw John Mayer. Okay, yeah. John Mayer. And Jason's comment was, you say it, about how fluid.
Well, the thing that is, I'm sure, isn't even a blip on your radar, but to me is the most extraordinary thing are the musicians that can improvise in their head. They're hearing the melodies in their head, and instantaneously it's coming out of their lip or coming out of their instrument, coming out of their fingers. That translation process to me is extraordinary, and that's what Mayer was doing all night long. There's no way he designed these solos. He's riffing in his head, and it's coming out the fingers, and I assume it's coming out exactly as he hears it in his head. That kind of ability.
Well, that's what I've always thought. I don't give guitar lessons.
Yeah.
I only give 2 lessons. One is use a metronome, because if you can't groove, you're not going to get any work.
Right.
And number 2, if you ever watch Oscar Peterson play, he's playing, but you can hear him going, basically he's singing.
Yeah.
And I always tell anybody who wants to learn to play the guitar is to sit down and sing while you play, because eventually you'll be able to connect singing the melodies in your head to your fingers, and that's how you get what the psychologists call flow, where you remove the conscious piece. And that's what most people do when they're improvising, is that they're actually translating the voice in their head to their fingers.
I remember watching a great documentary years ago about Isaac Stern, the violinist in China, and there was a section where he was teaching proteges, really gifted young violinists, and he was doing a master class, and this young woman got up and she played 16 bars of a piece, and it sounded great. And he went, yeah, put the instrument down. Sing it. Sing what you just played. And she sang it. And he said, now, pick up the instrument. Sing it as you play it. And it transformed her playing. And I thought that was remarkable. Wow. Yeah, just remarkable.
Jeff,
mostly because of phrasing.
Yes.
The melodies usually are pretty close, but the phrasing is, I would say, 60% of why people enjoy what you play. It's how you play it, not necessarily what you're playing.
So in prepping for this, because I haven't seen you in a long time,
could
you take everybody up to this speed of how Steely Dan formed Steely Dan, Doobie Brothers came to Doobie Brothers, brought Michael McDonald into the fold, but what was the background before that? Because you had a pretty interesting childhood up into that point that got you there.
Yeah, I grew up in Mexico City, playing a lot of rock and roll. Learned to play the guitar because my parents gave me when I was 9 years old, they gave me a guitar for Christmas. It pissed me off because I wanted a bicycle. But hung it on the wall. And then my friend Kurt Bundy, who was a guy who lived in the apartment house a few doors down, said, I'm taking guitar lessons, and if I show you some chords, maybe we could play a little bit. And I had already studied classical piano for about 5-6 years and never really thought about the guitar, so I started to play it, and something, the magic beam, whatever it was, and went, yeah, this is it. This is where I want to go. So that's kind of started it out. And then once you know 3 chords, you're now 90% on top of every rock and roll song from the late 50s and early 60s. So I formed a band with Abraham Laboriel, I was 11, he was 12. So Abe and I, we were just kids. And so we formed a surf band called the Tarantulas. And in those days, the Ventures, when they formed, they were only 2 guitar players, no drummers and no bass. So we didn't think it was weird for us the 2 of us, to play. So a friend of mine who worked at the Radio Éxito, which was the big radio station in Mexico City, said, why don't you come up and play your song, Tarantula? So, sure. So we went up there and played it, and they cut a lacquer while we were doing it, and they started playing it. And the next thing we knew, we were starting to get calls for gigs. And then I got a call from Humberto Cisneros from the Hooligans, which was a very big rock and roll band at the time, and Johnny Ortega, who was the lead guitar player in the band. And they said, hey, would you maybe like to come and do some gigs with us? And of course, I'm 11 years old. I'm 11 years old.
Jesus God.
And these bands, by the way, Los Locos del Ritmo, Los Hooligans, Los Absent Boys, these were big Mexican rock and roll bands, famous bands. So now I got a chance to play. And then I remember going to the first rehearsal, and I had my cheap little Alamo amplifier. I mean, Johnny Ortega had done what James Burton had done. He'd lowered the strings and put a banjo string on the top string so he could bend the strings. He was playing a Fender Stratocaster out of a twin reverb, which in Mexico City
doesn't happen.
First of all, the Stratocaster was $2,500 and a twin reverb was about the same. I just couldn't do it. And he turned it up all the way. Everything on 10, and I went, that's it. That's what I want to do. And then my dad, who had a disc jockey named Al Ross in Washington, D.C., was sending him records because he got so many records that he couldn't play. Didn't play rock and roll and had some jazz, but he sent 2 albums to my dad. H.R. is a Dirty Guitar Player and Color Him Funky by Howard Roberts. And when I listened to those records, it changed my life. Because I never not only heard anybody play guitar like this, I was listening to Wes Montgomery, Teddy Bunn, Kenny Burrell, all the cats. But this guy, I'd never heard anything like it because the way he played, he wanted you to come into the fold. So instead of dropping a billion semi-hemi demi-quavers on top of you, he opened up with melodies that you could relate to and then took you in. And I thought, man, this is amazing. So I learned everything note for note, learned to play it. Years later, met Howard Roberts, got him a guitar synthesizer because this is my 50th year working for Roland. And that was like, giving Howard a guitar set was like lighting dry grass. So I sat back and watched him, burn it up. And we became friends, and we were teaching at Guitar Institute of Technology. And his son, Jay, is a ferocious bebopper. Unbelievable guitar player.
Doing it. Your dad, I should mention too, you had a bit of an enriched environment because your dad was Don Draper. He ran all of the Southern
J. Walter Thompson.
J. Walter Thompson, biggest
I remember that name.
He was the guy.
My gosh.
Yeah.
So
wow.
Without the issues.
Yeah. So then I want to jump to get into Steely Dan, which everybody knows that band. I mean, it's still salient today. They're still selling out and still selling stadiums and arenas. The Doobie Brothers, still selling out today. Michael McDonald, you brought him in there. But the other big part of this, and I know Jason wants to participate in this in a big way, is you're one of the highest intelligence clearances, correct?
I'm not going to get into that too much. What I will say is I work for the Department of Defense, among other folk, and I do have some pretty high clearances that allow me to do my job. Yeah.
But you play red team.
Do you realize we just stumbled?
Yes.
We just stumbled onto the motherlode.
So here's the deal. So
this is the guy who knows. I'm
we'll
going to
go
get the
back-
answer
we'll go-
to my aliens question.
We'll go
before
back.
this ends.
We'll go back.
You and Dan Aykroyd and Lukather drive me nuts with that stuff.
Oh, Lukather too? Is it?
Oh, Luke drives me crazy with that
Oh,
stuff.
so Steve Lukather for Toto. We'll get back to Steely Dan in a minute. We'll get back to Steely Dan and Doobie Brothers. But let's jump ahead for a minute. Because what's fascinating about you, and I heard an interview that you did that blew my mind, where you talked about that you play red team a lot, which means you're the enemy.
Yes.
And you're anti-terrorism. That's the world that you're in. You got to predict what the enemy's going to do and why they're going to do it.
And how they might do
it. There are so many questions there about how do you stay ahead of the technology, et cetera. But I heard you talking about Putin, and a lot of people don't understand who the adversary is. Could you give, for just a moment, talk about Russia, China, North Korea, where we're at with them, and what we may not understand about what their end game is, and how you have to deal with them, because it's in front of everybody's mind right now because of the Ukraine, et cetera.
Well, one of my friends, General Hyten, who was vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we worked together a lot in the Shriever War Games. I used to drive him nuts. I mean, it made him miserable. I was on the red team. That was my job. We were friends, and none of us took it personally. But one day there was a meeting with some of the Joint Chiefs and some of the gamers, and he said, "Skunk, I want you to describe Russia for me in 5 seconds." I said, "Yes, sir. It's a nuclear-armed gas station run by the mafia." And General Hyten went, "Oh, there you go. Any questions?" And in a sense, that's really what it is. They make all their money. I would say 85% of the money that they make comes out of the ground. They make some weapon systems. Some are good, some are not so good. I mean, the Kalashnikov obviously is a fine assault weapon, but their airplanes tend to fall out of the sky. Although they are brilliant aeronautical engineers, manufacturing is not so good. But yeah, they dig everything out of the ground and then they sell it. Oil and gas and coal. And they just sell it to everybody. And that way, they don't really have to make much. I mean, I do own a Soviet-made electric guitar, which is just a hilarious piece of junk, designed by the Soviet radio electronics ministry of whatever the hell it was, with more crap in it. But okay, they took a shot. But yeah, nobody buys those guitars. They buy oil and gas. So Putin realizes that and basically runs his country on revenue from oil and gas. And China now is buying everything that Putin can get out of the ground. So they've formed a partnership. The Russians do make a few weapons that are pretty good, although they're buying more weaponry from North Korea than they are really making. So and also China is supplying them with electronics to build drones and things like that. But Putin believes that Russia was dealt a bad hand, and that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the countries in Eastern Europe that left the Russian sphere now need to be back in. And the whole Crimea thing was just the prelude to what we're going to see in the future, unless somebody steps in and changes that.
Okay, so I'm going to go back a step.
Yeah.
Because I'm
talking to Bob Lefsetz now. Now we're talking about Ukraine again.
Well, that's the step that we missed, and that is, Peter knows it because he knows you well and he knows your history well. But for people listening, how does a guy making his way in the wonderful, beautiful world of pop music and rock music suddenly wind up with the knowledge, the background, the experience, and the inclination to start working in missile defense for the United States government? How did that transition, or how did that addition, I should say,
well, actually,
come to be?
Fairly simple. Number one, I live in America, which is a place where you can do anything you want. And people, even though you might find some reticence and some pushback, most people that I know are at least interested in hearing what you have to say. Mm-hmm. So way back when we had some terrible fires in Santa Monica fire back in 78, And then we had the rains in 79, which, the hillsides were already stripped. So the gentleman across the street, his garage filled with mud, and he was an elderly gentleman. And so I volunteered to help him dig it out. So I went over there and we dug, and we finally got the stuff. He says, well, why don't you come in for a beer? I said, sure, that's great. So I went into his study, and the walls were covered with photographs of things like Sidewinder missiles and the F-100 and the F-106. He was an aeronautics engineer. He helped design the Sidewinder missile. So we were having a beer, and I said, yeah, I love airplanes. I think the whole concept is really cool. I said, well, thank you very much for your help, and I'm going to give you a subscription to Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine, which I still subscribe to today. Uh-huh. And I started reading it, fascinated, of course, because it was, the Russians called it Aviation Leak. It was translated and on its way to Moscow the day it hit an hour after it hit the newsstand in Washington, D.C. So I started reading it, and just around that time is when I started working for Roland and Akai and Fender and Gibson, but especially Akai and Roland, because they were electronics companies that focused on musical instruments. And at the time, the government was just beginning to understand the transition between the analog world and the digital world. Everything was becoming solid state. Tubes were disappearing. Transistors were the name of the game. So as I read this stuff, I kind of got this, I don't know, I store everything away. So I stored it away in some place in my mind. And then I was over in England, and I met the senior aviation editor for Jane's Defense Weekly, Nick Cook. We became friends. And I had a question. I said, I'm thinking about this. And I was talking to him a little bit about this idea that I had about maybe converting the Navy Aegis weapon system, which is an air defense system designed to protect surface and carrier battle groups from air-breathing threats, aircraft, and maybe converting it to do missile defense. But I needed some knowledge. So he gave me an article that wasn't classified, but very few people knew about, that somebody in England had tracked the space shuttle with an S-band radar. Now, S-band is one of a nomenclature for a number of different frequencies in the radar world. L-band, S-band, X-band, R-band. These are different parts of the frequency spectrum. But the Navy uses the S-band radar in their air defense systems. So I'm reading this, and I thought, well, wait a minute. If you can track the space shuttle, I wonder. So I went back to L.A., and I talked to my buddy John over at JPL, who was a steel guitar player as well. I said, John, I need you to do some math for me. So I gave him what I needed, and he comes back and says, are you looking to track something with a really low RCS, radar cross-section? I said, yeah. I said, well, you can do it. Here you go. Here's the proof. So I wrote an article on how to convert the Navy weapon system, Aegis system, to do theater missile defense, and gave it to Dana, Congressman Rohrabacher, who then gave it to Kurt Weldon, who was the vice chairman of the Armed Services Committee, who calls Dana and says, what is this guy from Boeing or Raytheon? And he goes, no, he's a guitar player for the Doobie Brothers. And so I get a call from Kurt Weldon saying, would you be willing to serve, take a position on the Armed Services Committee with what we're going to call the Civilian Advisory Board on Missile Defense? I said, yeah, sure, I guess so. And that started it all.
What a world you operate in.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah, and how you have to figure out how to navigate it. And as I'm looking at you, I'm thinking, I know how smart you are, and I know your history. But don't you ever get to the point where you go, what if I'm wrong? What if I gave my best shot? I think this works, but what if I'm wrong?
I don't have a problem with that. And that doesn't mean to sound disingenuous. But if you play a wrong chord on the guitar, you find the right one. If you write the wrong words on an essay, you go back and you edit it and you get the right one. If you make a mistake, if you're wrong, as far as I remember as a kid, that's the way you learned. you made mistakes and you learn from your mistakes. The problem with many organizations is everybody's so afraid of losing their gig that they are not willing to be wrong, and therefore they don't trust their gut feeling. So am I afraid of making mistakes? No. That doesn't mean that I don't, and that doesn't mean that I'm perfect. But I think unless you position your psyche to accept the fact that you may make mistakes, you don't get anywhere.
Did people have problems with you in the music world that I gotta run? I can only record for another 2 hours because I have a meeting, a missile defense meeting that I got to take a phone call on.
So I'm doing a session with Ringo Starr, wonderful guy, really sweet guy, and I'm playing steel. So we're doing this song, and it was really kind of weird. Ringo said, I got a feeling that you're going to have to leave. I know a little bit about what you do, and I think you're probably going to have to leave. I said, well, I don't think so. Mark Hudson was producing it, and he said, yeah, I think we're okay. So right in the middle of this, the door opens to the studio, and two guys walk in black suits, and they say, you got to come with us now. My pager had just gone off, and I hadn't even had a chance to grab it until they walked in. You got to go. And Ringo Starr, to his credit, said, I totally understand. As soon as you're done whatever you got to do, come on back. We'll finish the overdub. And I thought that was very, very interesting. I don't know how he knew that, but the thing the impression that it left me was, here is a guy who is totally open, who doesn't see things. Oh well, how dare you? You're working for me. You can't be. No, I accept the world as it is, and good. And when I was walking out the door, I says, "Good luck. See you in a bit."
Did he ever ask you later what exactly did you leave for? Never wanted to know.
No, but it wasn't important to him. And to me, what was important is we do what we do, and he had an open mind. And I just not only do I like him as a person. I mean, we're not close friends, but I have a tremendous amount of respect for him as a person for doing that. So yes, sometimes they clash, but most of the time, it's okay.
Never on stage, you perform with the Doobie Brothers and two guys walk on stage and pick you up.
You're coming with us right now.
It hasn't happened.
Right now. You're coming with us right now.
Yet. No.
Really? We're about to do... No.
Lift you up under the armpits and you're off stage? No,
is there a B version of you standing in the wings at all times ready for that contingency?
Well, during one of the war games, though, I got a call from Make-A-Wish Foundation, and they said, we're doing this big show. Can you play? And I said, gee, I don't know. I got 2 weeks at Nellis Air Force Base. I don't know if I can leave. And I talked to the principals, a couple of generals who were running the show. And I said, can I, what do I do? And they said, you got 24 hours. Go, do it. Come back, but we'll help you get there and back. But go do this. Now that's the kind of people that when you work with those kind of people, they're the ones that make things happen. They're the ones that are open, and they're the ones who eventually will move whatever the mission is forward and be successful. So I've been very lucky to be able to work with people who get it all. And half the guys I half the guys I work with, they're all musicians. Most of the guys at Lawrence Livermore, when I was working there, almost every physicist I know is a musician. Brian May.
Oh, Brian, yeah.
He's got his PhD in astrophysics.
Yeah.
But not Fast Eddie Teller, Dr. Edward Teller at Livermore was a concert pianist. We were actually going to do he loved Mozart, and we were going to do a recital together, but he had a stroke, and we couldn't.
With Teller?
Edward Teller. I worked for him because we were doing missile defense out at...
Unreal.
And a number of other, Mike Campbell, who was the head of the Laser Advisory Board where I was working at Livermore, guitar player. All these guys are musicians because of the relationship between physics and music.
So, okay, Jay, before we return to music for a minute, go for it. Here you go. Here's your moment.
Oh, you're giving it to me?
It's ready. Here we go.
So, We have aliens. Aliens. You know anything about them? I know you can't talk about it openly, but if you want to blink or, it's the thing I ask everybody that's deeply into the government. I go, yes, no. We had a guy in here who was actually hired to research the recent spate of stuff, like the little Tic Tac radar thing, sonar thing from the jet. He said, "We got nothing. We got nothing."
Sorry, I'm a little confused on the question.
Have you, in your time with the military, ever come across anything that leads you to believe there could be technology or evidence of technologies that are not of this earth?
Not really. Most, if not all, of the technologies that I think people assign to an alien civilization or culture, much of that technology appeared after World War II from the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
They came up with some pretty amazing things. Foo Fighters, for instance, that not the band FOO, but it was a French word, FEU, the French word for fire. These were globes that were 6, 7, 8 feet in diameter, glowing, sparking, that flew alongside the bombers in the 8th Air Force when they were bombing Germany. And it was described by a number of different members of the Air Force, so it wasn't a hallucination. What were they? Nobody knows. There has been some interesting research on anti-gravity work. And if you want to know more about that, there's a book that Nick Cook, my buddy from Change Defense Weekly, wrote called The Hunt for the Zero Point, which I would recommend you read. And it will lay out much of these technologies that are very, very, very advanced. And I'm not going to get into the details. So for me, much of it, if not all of it, is technology that has come from the human mind.
Mm-hmm. It's a good answer. It's the right answer. It's not my favorite answer.
Look at Jeff looking at you like, I don't care what your favorite
Yeah,
answer
of course.
is. Come on. He's calling Washington. He's annoying me. Have him taken care of. Getting back to music.
But we may have to understand that if you tickle the frumzoid and you put the Davenport shaft out of phase, that's how you get your answer.
Ah, there we go.
Okay.
And I knew Jeff was thinking about that. So let's wrap this up with a little bit of music. So Steely Dan, iconic band, jazz, rock, funk, they did everything. And they were notoriously, Walter Fagen and his partner, Mr. Becker, were tough taskmasters. You're an amazing player. Like I said, you have some iconic solos, which people still want to hear note for note when you play, just because they're in everybody's. You talk about embedded in people's heads. It must be amazing for you hearing them and you having the different view of it because you were there, you remember what happened that day, etc. Was it that tough being in Steely Dan? You were one of the founding members.
Well, it again, like everything else, things tend to morph. Things tend to develop and change. In the beginning, in the first 3 albums, or first 2 albums for sure, we were a band. Everything grew out of the musical relationship between the members of that band. Becker and Fagen had, because of the success of the band, I think they wanted to expand on their songwriting, and they wanted to expand into bringing other creative points of view into, which makes perfect sense. I got no problem with that at all. As a matter of fact, for me, the thing I liked about Steely Dan was I always felt that a good guitar solo was a composition in and of itself. It had to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It should stand on its own, even though it was part of a larger concept or a larger piece of music. It should fit inside, it should complement, but it should be a standalone. So to me, the idea that I think what Becker and Fagen were striving for in the later albums with pushing other musicians to the wall was to get them to understand that what they were looking for was a composition, a solo as a composition. Some people don't look at it that way. Some people look at it kind of in a linear fashion where you're just heading down the road, going down the track, and just
insert solo here. Yeah.
Bop till you drop and you can't stop. Great. But for me, this fit the way that I looked at things. Again, listening to Howard Roberts, every solo he ever did, everything he ever did was a composition.
Which you can hear, by the way, the new albums, The Speed of Heat, do a lot of different solos, dobro solos, lap steel solos,
pedal steel, which is my favorite instrument in the world.
Which are amazing. And then wrapping up with the Doobie Brothers, you brought in a Michael McDonald who completely changed the sound of the Doobie Brothers, alienated some people, but they had their biggest hits ever, correct?
I believe that's true, yes.
And and then time, because you were the change agent, time was done. Before you go, can I give you names and you just give me like reaction to the names, like whatever comes to your mind? Because you played with a lot of these people.
I'll consider it.
Doris Roberts. I'm just trying.
You've done that. I can do both of you. Elton John.
Incredible human being. I played in his band for a little while. We became friends, and I got nothing but good stuff to say about him.
Eric Clapton.
I don't know him that well, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for his ability to change the way that people listen to guitar playing.
Donna Summer, he did the hot stuff solo.
Yeah.
And Bad Girls. That was the first use of a guitar synthesizer on a #1 record. But she was a sweetheart, and she was a musician's musician. She got in there with both feet, got her hands dirty, was involved in everything, soulful, and it was like working for Dolly Parton. You just wanted to do it.
That was the next one, Dolly Parton.
Again, angel. Unbelievable. And incredible musician. A lot of depth. I don't think people understand the depth of her musical ability.
True or false, you played a gig in your bathrobe?
Oh, yeah.
Just to do it?
Yeah.
Just to mess with people to see what they do, or just you wanted to do it?
Just felt comfortable.
Your grandson came on stage to ask you for help with homework.
And Miles now is 18. He's going away to college, but he was 9 years old, yeah, and he came on stage, and I was actually in this classic rock band, American Vinyl, and I was doing China Grove, and I'm playing the solo, and Miles walks out, and he's got a question. So, okay, so he's my grandson. I know him, so I'm talking to him, playing the solo. You got to be able to split your brain and be able to do multitasking, which is why teach your children how to play music. Because if you want your children to be able to think in a nonlinear fashion, be able to think in using vertical logic, teach them music, because that's what music does. A musician is he's playing notes, he's playing chords, he's following rhythm, he's in a pocket, he's thinking ahead. This is vertical thinking. This is not linear. And what a great gift to give to your children.
See, what
I heard. Backstage security, not so great. That's what I got.
What I love is that you didn't get mad, that you just kind of went for it. And
my grandson.
It's
I love him.
That's beautiful. So thanks.
Well, thank you for your hospitality.
Jeff Skunk Baxter.